today we're going to talk about chapter 1, and that's about the Mesopotamians, which I should add is modern-day Iraq. But anyway, the Mesopotamians will go through a number of different civilizations and cultures over a period roughly 3,000 to 1,000 and beyond. 4 different civilizations, 4 different cultures, but they have much in common and there's a lot of continuity. And we'll also talk about Egypt, which has much more stability. It's a much more stable regime. It lasts basically basically it's continuous. There are some interruptions when there are sort of palace revolts, the nobles of the realm rising up against the dynasty, but for the most part Egypt is a very stable civilization, and that's all the way from the inception, the beginnings, roughly around 3,000, all the way down to roughly about 1080, 1085, and we're talking about a couple thousand years. So what about these cultures? What can we say about them? There's many things they have in common, there's many differences, and one of the hardest things to explain is why would Egypt be so stable, and at the same time in Mesopotamia it's not stable at all. There's a couple of overriding reasons, or major reasons for that. One thing is that Mesopotamia is built on basically it's on a plain. There's 2 rivers there, and they sort of define the area. But it's not a plain. It's very easy to invade. It's an area that's not easy to defend. So it's not a surprise that there's going to be so many cultures, that there's so many wars that go on there, and it seems like it's enduring. As opposed to Egypt, which is much easier to defend. To the south is desert, to the north is the sea, and on either side is either desert or large areas of water, which are not easily traversed. So Egypt has natural fortifications and natural protections, and so those are some of the differences, of course. Let's take a look at Mesopotamia first, and try to get a notion of, despite the fact that they were so unstable, they still made many great gains. One of the things that's so notable about these early cultures actually is that they did make so many gains. Remember, we're talking about the beginning of civilization. We're talking roughly around 3000 BC, and yet within a very short span of time, let's say short span, I'm talking about 1,000 years, both of these cultures are going to develop significantly. You're going to have the building of cities, you're going to have the origins of trade, you're going to have the development of crafts, you're going to have the development, for example, Egypt, beer is made, and I believe that they were able to make beer in Mesopotamia too. So beer is something you probably need if you live at this time, early civilization. The many other gains, the wheel, which makes possible mobility, which makes it possible to have carriages, to transport people or goods, to engage in trade. So that's very important. Language, written language. So you have cuneiform, one of the earliest forms of writing, and the Babylonians, of course, the Mesopotamians, will develop this kind of writing. So you do have the written language. You really can't have civilization without that. But here you have it. Tools. You have bronze tools in Mesopotamia. Later on, you also have iron tools. That doesn't come really down to about 1300. Mesopotamians will even know about the plow. So farming, agriculture is fairly advanced. Irrigation in order to really promote agriculture. Calendars, they have the first lunar calendars, which are significantly different, yet, for example, in Egypt they have 360 days plus what's called 5 intercalary days, giving you 365 days, which is pretty close to the actual year, which is about 365 and a quarter, and I think 11 minutes. So lots of advances are made. Now, Mesopotamia, as I said, was much more unstable. You have an earlier civilization, the Sumerians, and we find them roughly sometime after 3000. They're dominant in this area down to about 2200 or so. They develop a system of laws, which becomes codified later. They also have the calendar. They have rudimentary mathematics, but they do have that. They're very good at construction, and they're a form of architecture. Politically, one of the problems here was because of the unreliability of the Tigris and the Euphrates, the 2 rivers. They overflowed at unpredictable times. Other times they were too low. It made irrigation very, very difficult. The Mesopotamians did build canals. The Sumerians would have that, as would their successors. But the canals were difficult to maintain because of the unpredictability of the rivers. So it's for that also, as well as the fact that it was very difficult to defend. Mesopotamia is always going to be, whether it's Sumerians, the early civilization, or the Babylonians later, it's always going to be a bit more unstable. Another problem, Egypt is unified. In Mesopotamia, the civilizations there are, at least the early ones, Sumeria, never unified. You have a number of city-states which are independent and often warring against each other. So you have a problem there as well that increases instability. The Babylonians who follow after 2000 do bring a measure of stability. The kings there have enormous powers. They're able to unify much of the territory. Hammurabi gives them a codification of the laws, and the laws, of course, are nothing like our laws, but at least they do have codification. For example, they have laws regulating commerce. The main phrase to remember was buyer beware, caveat emptor. So it gives you some idea that maybe trade is not so easy. And of course, they have no law courts the way we do, even after Hammurabi. Justice is more or less personal. That is to say, you have to bring somebody to a sort of court to be judged, but it's up to you to do that. On the other hand, if a noble commits a crime as opposed to a commoner, the noble will be actually punished more harshly. If the crime is committed against the noble as opposed to a commoner, that will be punished more harshly as well. So inequality before the law is one way of describing this. Nevertheless, very important codification of laws. That's something that comes down all the way until the Assyrians overrun the Babylonians later on after 900. The Assyrians were a military culture. They did inherit much of the language, for example. They inherited the culture, the religion. But they're really a warlike culture, a military culture. And they bring a lot of instability. They're so vicious that they manage to turn almost everybody against them. And after 612, they're defeated by the next incoming culture, the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans will rule between 612 and roughly 540 when the Persians conquer them. So it's unstable area. At least no long-term political unification. City-states not always at peace with each other. A difficult agriculture makes for a really very unstable kind of culture and civilization. Religion is interesting with the Mesopotamians, and let me talk about that for a moment. Religion is mythopaic. It's based on mythology, myths, which are really stories which attempt to explain the meaning of life, how life is created, where we come from, the meaning of death, where we go. Not a very clear understanding. Maybe that's a reflection especially of the instability of the area. But religion is very tentative. The gods are unpredictable. The gods are cruel. And many of the Mesopotamian cultures actually fear the gods and don't rely on them. And the last culture, which has what's called an astral religion, worships the stars, and they see that these are the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans see the stars as gods, but they're so far away, they're inscrutable, they're unreliable. And so religion is rather difficult for the Mesopotamians because they can't rely on the gods. Nevertheless, their religion is an attempt to explain the kinds of things that the Egyptians will also attempt to explain. Let me talk about the Egyptians now. They're much more stable. The Nile overflows predictably at the same time of the year, virtually every single year. Seasons are built on that. The calendar is built on that. Agriculture is built on that. And Egypt, maybe because it has fortifications that can be defended, is much more unified, much more stable. It has a unified kingship. The king is regarded as having enormous powers, and of course the king is close to God, or the gods. And when the pharaoh, I should call them, when the pharaohs die, of course you all know that they're mummified, and they were put in these giant tombs, which were then set into the pyramids. And many of you are familiar with the pyramids, these great, huge buildings that were put together over many, many years, and where after the death of the pharaohs, they would live there. Politically, just to mention this quickly, Egypt is stable for roughly 2,000 years, 3,000 to 1,000. There are several different dynasties, that's true. You can divide this long history into the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. But there's a tremendous amount of continuity here. And I think a lot of it owes to the stability of the regime, the unification of the regime, the fact that the river is reliable, agriculture is more reliable. And Egypt also has a religion, I think, which helps the unification along. Egypt has three different kinds, or several different kinds of religion. Let me just talk about a couple of them. One is the main one that you know about, but it's also a mythopaic culture. Religion is myth. Myth explains, again, where we are from, where human beings come from. It explains the meaning of death, and Egyptians tried to do that. The Egyptians did have words for body and soul, Ba and Ka, and there was a little aperture actually in the pyramid, and also in what the bodies would be entombed in, and that aperture would allow the soul, once it's released from the body, to leave, but also to return. So there was a belief that you mummify a body because someday the soul might return to it and be reunified. So the pharaohs were buried early on in this way, but they were the only ones really who were given this kind of immortality or eternity. In any case, that was one form of religion, and you're familiar with some of the gods, Ra, and many others, Ra the sun god. And there's another form of religion which gives you some idea about the Egyptian, the way that Egyptians looked at religion. And this is based on one of their gods, Osiris, who was the god of the Nile and the god of water, and therefore the god of fertility and the god of life, and also the god of coming back to life. And in the myth, Osiris is torn to pieces by his enemy Horus, who is the sky god. And his sister, that is to say Osiris' sister, Isis, manages to find the different parts of his body, reassemble them, put them back together again. I guess he stitched them back together, and he comes back to life. And this is basically, it's a story which is talking about immortality, the revival of the seasons, but the revival of life, the eternity of life. And that's the way that Egyptians saw things, that everything was sort of circular. They didn't have the idea that we do of history, that history moves straight forward. Their idea was that everything is circular. And that was very typical in the ancient world. That was typical in Egypt. That was certainly typical in Mesopotamia. There's other stories, of course, to go back to the Mesopotamians. There was one long-standing story, went through a number of versions, called the Gilgamesh epic. And in this, it's very much, it'll remind you very much of the Old Testament, because there's a Noah-like story. Mankind is wiped out except for a Noah-like character because of his sins, and he's guilty of this and that. But mankind goes on. And then there's another character, Enkidu, who lives and communicates with animals and lives in the forest. And then one day he has sex with a harlot from town, and the animals no longer talk to him, and he's made to leave this wonderful Garden of Eden. Sound familiar? That's where the Hebrews got that story from the Mesopotamians. So religion offers a way, explains things to people, but it also offers a certain amount of power, confers a certain amount of power, especially in Egypt, on the pharaohs. You were not supposed to rebel against the state in Egypt. And that's very explicit, because the state is regarded as sacred, and therefore the pharaohs are the emblem of that sacrality, that sacredness. To rebel against the state is to rebel against the universe, and it's the greatest sin of all, right? Because the state is the emblem, it represents the stability of Egypt. And to go against the pharaoh is essentially to return everything to the state of chaos and the state of nature. So that's how the Egyptians saw things. That's why religion was very important, and it's a contributing factor to their stability. That's all for now. See you next time.